feel like I'm a background character in someone else's story.
Willis Wu.
You know my name?
Pretend to take my order.
Welcome to the Golden Palace. How may I help you?
Just act normal.
Welcome to the Golden Palace.
I tried to write the book for so long from the perspective of Willis's parents. And it wasn't until I sort of had this aha moment where it sort of, I heard Willis's voice and he was saying, I'm sort of a generic Asian man. It kind of gave voice to something that was in me, to be honest, like to say it so kind of baldly and just admit it, like that is how I am seen a lot. And yet that doesn't, begin to describe sort of what I think about, to be reduced to one thing. And I think that's why the telling it from this perspective was so, for me, like, I don't know, cathartic or something, I guess, because I wanted not just for Willis, but for all of these characters, for his best friend, for Lana, for Green and Turner, even, who are the leads. Like, I wanted them all to seem like they were people underneath. And so you get to see their surface in the beginning, and then gradually as the season goes on, they kind of strip those layers off and you see kind of who they are, and they show themselves and they grapple with what that means.
It captures psychologically how it feels oftentimes to be an Asian American in this country. That we are often invisible and we're put in very small boxes of what we're allowed to do, where we're allowed to go. And a lot of that was internalized. And of course, Willis has a lot of that internalization. He doesn't think he can move past just the back of the restaurant in Chinatown. And there are actually, in some funny ways that we show in the show, some interesting ways, that there is almost like a mysterious invisible force that he can't get out of this restaurant. And oftentimes that's a journey that we had to go through as Asian Americans. And even me as an Asian American actor, I had to go through that, because years ago, especially before something like Crazy Rich Asians, the parts weren't available. I was like just scraping for like bit parts, background parts. I was Chinese teenager #1 on a show. I was person in line. And I felt so lucky to even be able to get that, and get my SAT card. I just felt lucky. I felt good. And then I needed self-belief of, okay, even though I don't see a lot of people represented and doing this, I need to somehow trick myself into believing this is possible.
Or being visible for a role you don't want to be visible for. I think it's another, like I've been in shows where I'm like, I'd rather somebody didn't scroll down the IMDb list to see that I was in that episode of that show. But it's like early on in your career, you kind of got to take what you can get. And so trying to figure out how do you step into certain roles, but then step out of roles that you don't want to be in, like doing both of those things.
I think the idea of like Asian people not being heard from unless it's service industries or something, I mean, that's the most surface level reading of it, which is, I think there's a lot of truth to that. But obviously the deeper meanings behind that are this idea that like, yeah, you don't really value, like Asian people's voices are kind of invisible in American pop culture in terms of like decision-making positions, so yeah, obviously we get thrown a bone here and there, you'll see there'll be the Asian best friend, whatever in a rom-com, just to put it in there, but like essentially it's a voiceless proposition, right? You're telling someone else's story. So I think this project is such a great and smart way to kind of not only describe that emotion of being in the background, but then actually telling the story of it, of those background characters, which is only one of the meta layers of the story. So yeah, and that's something I think I can kind of see in America sometimes, like obviously we have very progressive friends, we're good friends everywhere in America, so day-to-day life maybe doesn't seem that bad, but we definitely feel like this ceiling, and I in culture. And I'm not saying it's the worst problem in the world, I'm not saying we're the only ones who face it, but that ceiling is there. And so for anyone who's ever felt this kind of cultural ceiling in America, I think this show is kind of for that.
It touches on all these themes of identity and belonging in a way that I think we all can relate to a little bit, but in a really playful, fun way that makes it not just so like teaching, but we're having a laugh.
Yeah, because we're taking the lighter side, right? I mean, we can be down in dumps about it, right? But in this show, man, you yuck it up. You see it and say, oh my God, this is so ridiculously funny. So I think that's the beauty of this show, is that we acknowledge it, but we acknowledge it in a way where you're gonna have the room to understand and listen and say, you know what? Yeah, you know, it's kind of funny, but not really, you know. So I think it's a good delivery device on our show.
I mean, I think all effective like humor really is rooted in some real truth that we can identify, right? And we can use that as a mirror to ourselves and
That's
humanity.
The abduction may be related to reports of a gang war.
Whoa. Who is that?
She looks Thai.
Dude, she's clearly Korean. Know your Asians.
You know, for me, being mixed, we definitely played with that metaphor, and I very much identify with that, with being, you know, I think in the beginning they introduced her as she's brought on for cultural reasons. And I think the theme of being racially ambiguous but white enough for people to be comfortable with is something that I very much have been used as, you know, I've been a pawn for that for most of my career, and I think in a lot of ways in my life. And so it wasn't hard to, you know, have that be something that's relatable.
I think in day-to-day life, you often just, I think we've been conditioned now to be so disconnected from each other that you walk around and you kind of view everyone around you in the world as day players in your story. And, you know, I certainly do. And that's like, then, you know, doing the show, I was like, oh my God, it's such a weird way of looking at human beings and other people who are thinking probably the same thing. So I walk past them, but it's, you know, and because we are all, you know, we're all the main character in our own stories. But to learn a bit more, it's just, I think it's kind of like a little bit more of an awakening for human beings to realize that everyone is a main player in some ways, and like you kind of, there's so much more to people than we ever imagined.